Welcome. This video covers common variable name manipulations that you might want to do in Sas. Let's take a step back and talk about big picture stuff for just a minute. We are talking about how to read in data. We now have a pretty good idea how to read in well-formatted data. That's one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest steps to doing any analysis, getting your raw data into your software. But once we do have that raw data in, we then oftentimes want to do some manipulations to it. It's not usually ready to go at that point. We're not ready to summarize it and analyze it quite yet. What we want to do instead are some common actions that you might see, such as subsetting observations or rows, as well as subsetting your variables or columns. I'm going to use that language a little bit interchangeably throughout this video, so I'm going to refer to variables and columns interchangeably and observations and rows interchangeably. Another thing that you might want to do would be create new variables or new columns. And so we'll look at how to do that in this module as well. And then we'll take a little bit of time talking about just some very basic ways to combine more than one data set into one data set. But what's cool here is once we get through the ideas in this part, we are going to have our data ready to go to do whatever summarizations and analysis that we want to do. So that's fantastic. Let's recap some of the Sas code that we've learned so far. We've actually learned a decent amount at this point. We have our libname statement. We're going to continue using this libname statement all the time to create our libraries. We've also seen how we could use that to read in data as well. We have our file name statements that we use sometimes when we read in our data. Proc import is our main method for reading in data. We have proc contents, which tells us metadata about the data sets that we have read into Sas already. And remember, one of the key things that we want to focus on with proc contents output is how are our variables stored. We have two types in Sas, character and numeric. And then we talked just briefly about how to reorder the rows using proc sort and a by statement on that, and then how to print out a data set using proc print. Lastly, we talked very briefly about the data step and some of its capabilities. This data step is going to be really key to what we're doing with all of the data manipulations in this particular module. And so it's important to just sort of remind ourselves of the basic syntax that we might have with this data step. So remember, with the data step, we start with a data statement. And with that data statement, we define what data set we are going to be creating. And we can use a 1 or 2 level name for that. Remember, if we use a 1 level name, which would just be what we see after the period there, that would create a data set in our work library, which then would be erased when we close down Sas. Alternatively, we can use a 2 level name that then puts it in a particular library that is hopefully a permanent library, and then also naming the data set as well. We saw the use of the set statement. We're going to continue to use the set statement throughout this module. And that set statement just copies a data set that you might have access to. And again, you might access that data set that you want to copy through a 1 or 2 level name. And what we're going to do in this module is we're going to start investigating a lot of these other steps and statements, all these different statements that we could add to this data step. So we've already seen a rename statement, but we'll look at things like label statements, drop and keep statements, and so on. All right, hopefully you're pretty excited about that. Let's start with, well, what kind of data manipulations are common that we might want to do? And what this first video is about is just changing the way that our variable names display, or changing the actual names of the variables themselves. So again, each one of these columns has a variable name associated with it. And what we might want to do is just change the actual name of that variable, or just change the way that it displays whenever we say print out the data set or do some analysis. That's what we're going to cover in this video. Okay, we've already seen this rename statement, but let's just recap it, and we'll also see it a different way that we can utilize this rename. So with the rename statement, again, we're using that same kind of syntax that we did before. We're using a data statement to start our data step. In this case, we are creating a new data set called umps2 in the NCSU library, which we must have created previously. And then we're copying a data set that we read in. If you recall, this umpire data set was one that had, this was a greater than delimited file that we read in. And remember, it did not have column names. And so we had to set our own column names using this rename statement. Again, this semicolon here is ending the set statement, so this is actually a separate statement within our data step. It starts with the keyword rename and ends with its own semicolon down here. And the syntax for using the rename statement in this case was just name your old variable, so what is the previous variable called, and then you put the new name on the right hand side. And that was all we had to do to rename our variables in Sas. Not too bad. Well, that's, again, not the only way that we could rename our variables. There's also what's called a data set option. This is a separate statement, so this would be a statement option. Sorry, this would be a rename statement. This is a data set option here. And we call it a data set option because it's going to go directly after the data set that we are copying in this case. And so you can notice that the syntax here is a little bit different. We don't just put rename and then space the variables that we had before and what we want to rename them to. Instead, we're going to use this parenthesis and then rename and then an equal sign and then more parentheses. So the syntax is slightly different, but the behavior is going to be basically the same, other than this little caveat we'll talk about in just a minute. But let's go through this code real quick. So we have the same thing that we did before, data ncsu.umps3. So now we're creating a new data set called umps3 in our NCSU library. Then we are going to copy the umps data set from the NCSU library. And again, we're now going to use a rename data set option. And this allows us to rename the variables before we are copying them over into our new data set. Again, the syntax is slightly different here. We need to have a parenthesis after our data set that we're copying. And within there, we can put more than one data set option. That's why we need to have these parentheses. We're going to have the rename option and then how to specify the new variables there. We could also have other options we'll talk about in a little bit. All right, so the syntax might seem a little bit confusing, so it's important to sort of understand the Sas Help so that we can figure out if you had to do a new data set option, how would I do that? Well, again, a great thing about using Sas Studio is it is going to pop up help for you. It's going to give you some hints and things that will help make your life a lot easier. If you go and you start typing ncsu.yada yada yada and you put a parenthesis here, it will then pop up a whole menu of data set options. You can see that just the ones that you can see there are tons of different data set options you can do when you're copying your data set over. If you scroll down to rename and you sort of hover over it or click on it, it then shows you the syntax for how to do the rename statement. And what we need to do if we want to use rename, we put rename and then equal, and then you can see there's another parenthesis, another set of parentheses you need to do there. You put the old name equal the new name. Again, this is Sas telling you this is how you do this particular action. If you want to rename your variables using this data set option, look, here's the syntax. After your parenthesis, rename equal parentheses, old name equal new name. Okay, let's see this again through a different statement and different data set option, and hopefully we'll start to get the hang of it. Again, rename changes the actual variable names themselves on your data set. Alternatively, you might just want to have more descriptive labels attached to those variable names so that when you print out your data set or you do some analysis, those nicer looking labels appear. How you do that in Sas is called a label. And so there's a label statement and a label data set option. Okay, again, this is not going to overwrite your names of your data set. This is just going to create a descriptive label. And if you started to type in a label statement, so again, notice that I've ended my set statement here with a semicolon. So now I'm starting to type a label statement. Sas Studio is going to pop me up some help and say, oh, here's the syntax for how you deal with this. You can do label, variable 1 equal, and then notice that you have to give a quoted string. And that quoted string should be what you treat as your label, right? So that's what you want to label your variable as. And you can either just continue to put multiple variables and multiple labels on one label statement, or you could actually write multiple label statements. Either way is fine. Now, one thing to make sure that you understand is that you are, again, just sort of associating this label with a variable. When you go to program and you go to code, you still use the actual variable names that the variable has. So you're not going to use these labels when you go to, say, create a plot or create some summary stats. These labels are really just to create nicer displays when you print out your data or summarize it. Let's look at an actual example of using that label statement. So just like we saw in that previous syntax, we can just do label. We can put our variable that we want to put a descriptive label for, an equal sign, and then a quoted string for the label we want to assign to it. And when we create labels in a data step, these are called permanent labels, and they're going to be associated with that data set anytime that you would then go to use it in, say, a proc step. So if I did proc print data equal umps2, because that's the data set I'm creating up here, these labels will be associated with that data set there, and you can call them and use them in that case. You can also create labels in Proc steps, but then they aren't permanently associated with them necessarily. If you then go and look at your data set in the viewer, so if you did run this code and then looked at what happened, you can change what you're looking at up here in the top. This view, you can either view column labels or the variable names themselves. Since we've now given nice descriptive labels, it's a little bit nicer to be able to go and look at these columns in this format instead. And in this case, I'm clicking on the home variable, and it actually shows down here in the sort of metadata about the data set that it displays down here. It's showing you that there is a label associated with this variable, and there's the label written out. Again, these labels are just here to give you a nicer way of looking at these variable names. If you want to see these variables whenever you print something out, all you need to do is add a label statement on your proc print statement. Remember, if you want to use proc print, all you basically need to do is do a proc print statement, specify the data, and then do a run statement. That sets up a proc print step. Well, again, if we want to have these labels actually show up when we print out our data that way, we just add a label option on our proc print statement. This language is tough, I know. We have a label option on a proc print statement that is within a proc print step. How fun is that? But again, you can see the sort of advantage here. When I print this out, I get much nicer looking variable names. Okay, now let's also talk about the difference between this dataset option versus our statements, because we have these two ways to do it. You might ask, well, why would I want to do one versus the other? And the big difference is that statements are going to copy the entire dataset over first and then make the changes, whereas a dataset option is going to make the changes prior to copying that dataset into the data step. So if we look at this code down here, we are using a rename statement. Any of the actions that we do with this rename statement are going to occur after we've copied the dataset over. We're using a label statement. Again, the actions we're going to do with this occur after we've copied the dataset over. And you might notice that something here might not work quite right. We have the changing of the variable names being done after copy, but we are trying to use labels based off of the new names, right? We're trying to use these new names down here in our label statement. But those new names don't take place until the data step finishes, right? Those new names aren't going to take over until we finish this data step, which means that this is going to throw an error. These variables down here will not be found, home, away, and HP umpire. Those are not going to be found in the data set that we are working with within the data step. So again, we have copied over this data set that has var1 through var6 as its variable names, and so when I go to use my label statement, I need to reference home as var4 in this case, away as var5, and HP umpire as var6, because that is how those variables look within the data step itself. If I wanted to do this and make it work correctly, one thing I could do is use the rename dataset option, which means that it's going to change things before it does the copy. Okay. So again, I'm using a dataset option here, and that's changing it before it copies. That means that var1 is no longer the name of the variable when it's in the data step. That variable name is year, which means that later if I wanted to go and use those or reference those within the data step, I need to use the new names that I've created. So this code down here, this will work correctly. All right, we now have seen how to rename our variables and also create labels. Let's go and jump into Sas and see a couple examples of that. Here we are in Sas. We're ready to go. We're ready to program. We are now into our second section. So the data sets that we want to deal with for our videos, the programs we make in our videos, they're going to be located here in this folder. Again, you have access to all of this shared stuff if you were enrolled in the course. And what we want to do is first create a new Sas program. We'll just use one program for all of the videos we do here in Module 2. We'll create a snippet, or we'll grab one of our snippets that we already did, double click on it, it'll toss it into here, and this will be Module 2 video programs. And again, we're going to use this libname statement to create a library. This is going to create a reference to a particular folder. And again, I have this folder called mylib up here that I've created. So this is going to be where my library is on my Sas On Demand for Academics session. All right. We'll have to run that code to create that library, but we also want to read in a data set. The data set we'll read in for this particular example will be the wine quality full data set. We can see that this ends in a .csv. Remember, .csv is one particular extension that sort of tells us what the delimiter for the data is. This is a comma-separated value file. That means that I can go to use proc import. I specify the data file. I need to give it a quoted string to that path. Since this is, again, on the shared drive, you can go ahead and link to it and copy it from there. So I've just right-clicked on the wine quality full data set. I went to properties, and then I can copy this location. The only thing that's going to change for you are the numbers that are associated here. We'll hit paste. Again, to do that, we go over here to wine quality full. We right-click, go to properties. That shows us the location of this for us, for wherever you're at. All right, now Sas and proc import knows exactly where this data set is. We need to tell it a few other things like what type of data set it is. It's a CSV, so our database management system should be CSV. We need to specify where to output that data set. We're going to put in the NCSU library as a data set called MyWine. And then we're going to say get names, and this is one that has names associated with it. That's something you'd have to check in the raw data file itself. And we'll highlight this and run it. Always check our log first anytime that we run our code, right? Oh, hey, it's writing this really long, beautiful data step that we don't need to know about at this point in time in our lives. But we don't see any red, we don't see any green, and the data set was successfully created, so we have some idea that maybe things went well. We check our output data. Seems okay. We have, let's see, a bunch of variables over here on the left. Variables are columns. And then we have about 6,500 rows. So that's great. Now, again, what we're focusing on in this video are changing some of our variable names and the labels they have on them. Well, one thing you might notice here is that the variable name on this is fixed acidity with a space. And that might not make quite perfect sense to you because in Sas, usually our variable names are one character string or one, they're not a string because we don't use quotes, but one block of text with no spaces in it. It turns out you can have spaces in your variable names, but you have to use a special way to reference those. And it's going to be really annoying to have to reference all of these different variables with these spaces. And so what we might do is go ahead and replace some of these variable names with ones where we don't have to reference it in that way. All right, how do we do that? We use our data step. So we'll start that with a data statement. We'll create a new data set, ncsu.formatted wine, maybe. Again, we're not case sensitive here, so it doesn't really matter if you're following the exact case that I'm using. And then we're going to use a set statement to copy our read-in data set, ncsu.mywine. And I'm going to use a data set option to do the changes before we copy over. And let's see, we have fixed acidity that has a space in it. How you deal with a variable that has a space in it in Sas, you can use a quoted string, fixed acidity, and then you put an N directly after that quoted string. And that's like a literal, so it's saying fixed acidity as a literal thing here. And I'm going to call this thing fixed underscore acidity, just so it's easier to deal with later on. And we'll do that for all the different variables that have a space. So volatile acidity, if I can spell this, is going to be a real challenge for me. Volatile acidity, I didn't put it in quotes. I'll have to fix that. But this is how we utilize our, oh, sorry, I'm not even using the right syntax here. So we put a data set option. We need to say that we're using a rename statement or a rename option. All right, then we put an equal sign and we put the extra parentheses. So I was already working on the inside parenthesis there. I apologize. So we have our data set options that start with a parenthesis. We're going to use a rename option. We're going to rename these variables that we list out. So we'll just have a couple more and I'll stop talking and speed up this video in just a second. All right, after much typing, I now have all of our different variables that we want to rename in our rename option. And I'm just going to end that set statement now with a semicolon. At this point, I might want to add in some labels. And maybe what I want to do, so I'm going to use a label statement, so I don't need an equal sign there. So I'm going to use a label statement, And maybe I don't want these underscores whenever I actually go to look at these variables, but I want that original name to look a little bit nicer. So again, when we use the rename dataset option, it's going to make the changes beforehand. So if I want to reference these variables and give them labels, I want to use the new names to do so. I'll go through and add different labels to each one of these. Now I've added in all of the different labels that we want to do for our variables to make them show up a little bit more nicely. I'll go ahead and end that label statement with a semicolon. Now I'm going to use a run statement to finish off my data step. And we'll go ahead and print out this data using a print statement and a print step. I want to reference my new data set that I just created, so ncsu.formatted line. And I'm going to add the label option up here to make sure that those new labels show up. I'll hit run. I'm going to highlight those two chunks of code and hit run. Hopefully things work out nicely. Again, when we do this kind of thing, we always want to check our log first. This is taking a little while to run because we have 6,500 observations, so it's printing out all of those to an HTML file, which does take a little time. And so remember, anytime that we run our code, we always want to check our log first to make sure that nothing went wrong. So we go up here to our data step that was submitted. There's no issues or anything that we see there. Proc print step that we submitted, no issues we see there. So again, we can go to our results here, and we can now see that we have these capitalized versions with the spaces associated here. So we do see our labels being given there. If we look at our output data set that we created, here's the NCSU formatted wine data set. Notice that this is fixed underscore acidity as the actual variable name itself, though. So we've changed the variable names, but we've also changed their labels. We'll go ahead and save this program, and we'll continue this in our next video. Hopefully this video has now given you a pretty good idea how to deal with two common things that we want to do to our variable names. One, change those names, and two, change the way that they appear when we print them out. We've also noted here that there are differences between data set options and statements. You can do the same manipulations either way, but underneath they're doing slightly different things, so we do need to be careful how we do one versus the other. And we'll see in the next video where we talk about keep versus drop that sometimes we want to use a data set option to improve our efficiency. And so we'll check that out next.